It looks like a great group of people here. This is our final Minnesota Injury and Violence Prevention Action Coalition webinar. We have gone through our state plan and we've dived into each of our shared risk and protective factors. I should say we've done 4 out of the 5, and today is our 5th. So in November, we talked about health equity. In January, we talked about community connectedness. Then we moved on to economic justice. And last month, we went deep into the built environment. And now we are here to talk about social emotional learning. And so these are all great shared risk and protective factors that have been found to decrease a number of poor health outcomes, specifically ones that we address in our injury and violence prevention section. And also with our partners across the state. So as with each of our past topics, I encourage attendees to think about, how can each of us address this topic? Who do we need to work with? Who's not at our table? What are the 2 most important things that you want to do right now that you have the capacity for? And then looking forward, what are 2 other things that you might want to do next, but that you need different or more resources like money, time, people? And then we can have a conversation, how can we support each other in finding those resources? So today we have 2 great panelists who are joining us. We have Kevin Schumacher, who is the Central and West Central Regional Behavioral Health Coordinator for the Minnesota Department of Health. She is a disaster responder and specializes in cognitive behavioral therapy with high-risk individuals. She specializes in guided staff support and communications advocacy, and she generates and produces marketing materials for the regional behavioral health coordinator team. We also have Jacqueline Carpenter, who is the Vice President of Workforce Development and Empowerment Institute at Twin Cities Rise. She oversees the Empowerment Institute as well as the dedicated sector-based trainings in collaboration with their employer partners. Jacqueline is responsible for engaging new employers for pathways, partnerships, internships, and job placements for program participants, as well as expanding the Empowerment Institute and its customer base across the US. So I'll let them each say a little bit more about themselves and their work as we move through our questions. And as usual, I invite questions in the chat if folks have them, and we can try to incorporate those into our discussion. And we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So to center us all, could each of you please share your working definition of social emotional learning? I think it's a term that's used and maybe we don't all have a common understanding. So we didn't decide beforehand who's going to go first. But if either one of you wants to jump in, feel free.
Go ahead, Kevin.
Sure. So, thank you so much for that introduction. So, I guess when I think of social emotional learning, I think that it's really a skill that is learning throughout the lifespan of individuals. So you learn it, you can learn it as a child, you can learn it as an adult, in which people develop these specific skills, whether it be with their decision making, their self awareness, interpersonal skills, things along those lines. And as well as focusing on the strengths that they already have. So children, they have strength in playing, and so how can we make play a learning opportunity for them? Adults have different strengths, and taking those strengths with them and learning how we can better understand empathy, better understand each other's emotions or your own emotions, and how we can react to them in the moment or down the line. That's all I have.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, Jacqueline, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, we use the framework of emotional intelligence as we speak about social emotional learning. So we spend a lot of time on the 4 building blocks of emotional intelligence, We're calling those out as self-awareness, self-management, other awareness, and relationship management. We do express that our learning is best throughout this journey. So I concur. It's a lifelong journey of social emotional learning. And it is something you can constantly build forward. It is skills that, we can retrain and rethink about how we feel and what we do about our feelings. Feelings drive behaviors. So we spend a lot of time um, really building those thoughts and feelings and how we respond and react to them. And we do a lot of training around the behavioral application of what we've learned. So we spend an enormous amount of time being much more than knowledge acquisition. We want people to experience it. And we do a lot of this work with adults. That's how our program actually started 30 years ago, is that we used emotional intelligence learning. We created our own custom human connection and interaction of training. And we recognized about 5 to 7 years ago that our adults that we were serving said, how do we bring this into our household? So then we wanted to work on building those skills forward. So very much in the mind of playfulness and where our young people's cognitive development, how do we bring those same type of emotional intelligence learning tools and resources to children as they're growing up and their brain is developing? But we also have the adult program that is really helping us to relearn and relook at our emotions and how they play such an important role in our lives.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you both for kind of centering us on this. So how have you seen, or how do you see emotional learning, a social emotional learning, as an injury and violence prevention tool? Maybe you can also dive into a bit of your current work and how it relates to social emotional learning.
Sure. I can go. So I would say that it's all about learning and continuing to learn. So as human beings, we are challenged every single day with different experiences and different blockers, and continuing to learn how to react to those in the moment. Continuing to enhance the skills that we already have, as well as focus on skills that we may not have, and how do we involve all of this. And so specifically, the regional behavioral health coordinators, we provide several trainings that are either skill based, or they focus on something that is really troubling at the time. So we have a verbal de-escalation training that Luke Campbell does, and he does a great job doing that. And how do we focus on verbal de-escalation and enhancing those skills in the moment, whether we're dealing with a Zoom meeting, or a Teams meeting, or we're face to face, and how can we do and enhance the skills or learn these skills, because some people might not have them, which is okay. We do grieving our losses and survival guilt, psychological first aid, and I think the really big one that we as our BHCs focus on is skills for psychological recovery. And how do we take the skill that we already have and really break it down into simple, manageable, achievable situations. And like Jacqueline was saying, really being hands-on with the learning, like get into that environment, and how can we, instead of just reading, oh yeah, that makes sense, how about let's practice this now in a setting in which seems more realistic for the situation that we're engaging in.
Amazing. It's so fun to think about how it can provide impact. And I think that I was just listening to you and I got totally spaced out of the question, because I'm like, wow, this is it's so important for our service providers to have that extra layer of how we can do the work and how we can, replicate the work. So I was actually thinking of our own staff in service and in community, how we need those skills to demonstrate them and teach that. At Twin Cities Rise, we spend a lot of time in our emotional intelligence training focusing on the power within. And that's in the second quadrant of emotional intelligence, where it's that self control and self management. We do a lot of work in the early part of our training to provide resources around, are you giving that power away? So you're reacting, or are you holding that power within so you can respond? And we do a lot of work around that control. And the real essence of controlling your reaction or your response is knowing what you're feeling And the more you can tap into that emotion and understand, does that trigger you? Does that emotion, how do you pause that emotion a little bit and think about it before you're moving into action? Those are really critical things to keep practicing and to practice them over and over again. And I think that's where we've seen a really big lift in our younger youth program related to youth prevention. But we've also spent a lot of time on the flip side about, youth lateral violence and how people are processing the violence they're seeing. They may not be the one in action and in motion or even in the situation, but witnessing it, it leaves a mark. And when people are in a victim situation or they've experienced that, we all process that in a really intentional way. And we spend a lot of time even working on the release of those emotions and processing those emotions so we're not harboring them intentionally. So being very mindful about not just how we're controlling in the moment, but also how we're responding and holding on to the things that are happening around us. So I think there's kind of a twofold component to how does this emotional intelligence or social emotional learning play into the broader category of violence in general? Yes, there's a preventative component, and you can spend a lot of time in that because it takes a lot of practice. But then there's also how do we make sure we're releasing some of that um, the emotions, and I don't want to say negative emotions, there's no bad emotion, but how do we release the stress and the anxiety and the hurt so we're not holding on to that and then reacting and just moving right into being included in the violence. So two very intentional initiatives as we look at our communities. There's always the healing aspect, but there's also the preventative aspect. And I think emotional intelligence brings us to our fullest potential in each of those spaces. But we have to recognize the learning of it, and then we must apply the practice of it. Those two things have to be hand in hand as we're walking through this journey with individuals. It's really important that we're practicing it.
That's so interesting. I'm thinking back to some of our earlier webinars that we had, even about health equity and about community connectedness. And our speakers for those two topics also really emphasized this idea of practice. And I thought it was such a great reminder of these concepts that we're trying to focus on. These shared risk and protective factors are really big concepts, really big constructs, and to look at them as things that need to be practiced allows us that space to make mistakes and to learn. Practice is something you do to learn and get better at something rather than assuming people are going to be able to master these concepts and ideas right away. The idea to reframe it as a practice, I think, frees us in a bit to say, oh, I made a mistake. I'm going to try it again. I'm going to do better next time, instead of feeling maybe, frustration or failure right off the bat. So I think that's, both of you have really talked about this idea of practicing, which is, I think, so important. Um, so with that idea and saying, we need to practice these things, how do you teach social emotional skills? You've spoken a little bit about your audience, but who is the ideal audience? Is there an ideal audience for these skills?
You want me to go again, Jacqueline?
Sure, go ahead.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. I would say, so for teaching social emotional skills, I would really just say it would come down to attending the trainings. Either to help yourself or to pass these skills on to others, whether that be youth or adults. So, um, skills for psychological recovery teaches like obvious these specific skills which can be tailored for an adult audience as well as a youth audience, and where you can teach them in that specific moment, whether again for yourself or for others. And so um, these skills are taught in segments that focus on managing healthy connections, gathering information about the situation that's going on. So speaking on violence prevention and violence. Um, if there was a specific incident that happened, gathering that information about the situation and prioritizing what would be the best thing to address first in that situation. creating problem solving skills and how we can create those skills in the moment. I know Jacqueline had talked about that. So how we can create that in the moment, as well as for preventative for later on in the future, again, through practice. Promoting positive activities in children and adults that are affected by situations, or just for them to generate them these ideas in general. So people might be having just feeling in a rut or just having some sort of situational things going on. So how can we create these promoting positive activities for them in the moment? And then promoting helpful thinking, not positive thinking, helpful thinking, and what's helpful in the moment. And so these are really the basic goals of SPR. However, they really focus on the supportive factors of preventing these maladaptive behaviors, as well as identifying and supporting adaptive behaviors with youth and adults. And so, how can we really focus on all of that in building these skills and helping them create achievable goals in that moment?
Yeah, I love that. I think it's so important for us. We really want to set a strong foundation when we're bringing people into training programs, right? And it is as easy as just showing up because reality is we're all human beings. That means we're already social emotional creatures. It's just in us. So we have elements of it happening in us from the day that we are born and from that entire life's journey. It's happening. And we just need to help lean into that, right? So I think the training opportunities, every moment of connection and experience is an opportunity to help bring that journey to life. So it can happen very naturally, but in both of our programs, it's to be in attendance. It starts by showing up, right? It starts by just attending. And at Twin Cities Rise, we spend a lot of time recognizing value. So many individuals in our adult program and our youth program don't see their own value. And as soon as we connect to our inherent value, it changes that whole trajectory of the journey, right? They start seeing themselves in a different light. We have a very important message that we bring out through our training, and it is I'm lovable, I'm important, I'm valuable, and I'm empowered. And if I believe that about myself, then I must also be able to believe that about you. We are really spending a lot of time in our training making sure that we recognize that birthright because there's not a situation or person who can ever take that away. We always will have that birthright with us. So we're working through that differently with adults than with children, right? But we're still bringing that inherent value to light. And once we're connected with that, then all of this stuff becomes sequential. It is a bit of a stacked learning module here at Twin Cities Rise. Doesn't mean it has to be, particularly if you're in a therapeutic setting, but for the training that we're providing, because we're not therapists, but we are definitely experts in emotional intelligence. And we want to build that learning and that journey together. So we do have stacked learning, but we use a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy methods in the way that we bring the skills to light. So we always say, how do you teach it? Well, with youth, you have to do it in different dosing and you have to do it based on their cognitive development. So how ready are they? ACEs definitely plays a part in our work because we also recognize that trauma can, you know, kind of pause some of the emotional maturity, and we need to respond to that, and we need to make sure we're understanding and graceful in that space. But for the most part, it's really sequential learning, and it's a journey. Our program is designed specifically to be slow. We did it intentionally because it is about the way that we feel about ourselves, and it's a journey of application, not just a quick learn. So I think I mentioned earlier to Catherine is that, social emotional learning, it can be very much in your head, right? And I think some of our schools have done a great job of making sure that we recognize the knowledge of what it is and that knowledge acquisition can happen. But what we want to really do is get to application, and that's the heart. So we spend a lot of time about processing and a lot of time of practicing. Our program is long intentionally because we want the head and the heart connected. And when we're able to really move into those examples of behavior intervention and behavior safety, that's where we're really accelerating people's trajectory of their potential and reaching their best potential. It's a journey. It never really stops. You can pick it up at any given time. Adults need this. I've benefited greatly from it. as a staff member at Twin Cities Rise, it was one of my first things I did was take the training. And it took me a minute to realize this isn't about what I'm offering to my clients. This is actually about me. How am I showing up for myself? How am I showing up for others? And once I started that journey and really started working it, it's not ever ending. And it's amazing how that ripple effect does take hold in your life. My family has not been through our training, but they already speak that common language. I see my daughter doing those things because she's witnessed it in me. So there is an amazing ripple effect when we talk about impact in our community. And at every experience we have, it's an opportunity. And so I think it's for everyone. We say, how do we start teaching it? We just need to start engaging, activate it. Everybody's worthy of it, right? And so I think there's so many different ways to experience it. We have one method here at Twin Cities Rise, but there's several methods of becoming emotionally intelligent and focusing on your EQ, not just your IQ. And I think that right now it's very top of mind, not just for our youth, not just for our community, but even for our workforce. So if you've ever tapped into LinkedIn recently, there's emotional intelligence all around you, right? If you go to the airport, there's a whole section on health and wellness, and most of it's emotional wellness, right? It's all around us. So it's finding the thing that works for you and working it. It's as simple as finding what works for you and activating it. But in our youth programs, it's making sure that there's that introduction of it. And with our adult program here at Twin Cities Rise, they're usually going through some stuff, right? So we also want to make sure that we're creating that trust and that safe space because this does require some vulnerability. It does require some humility. And as facilitators, we're responsible to create that setting. So kind of a long answer, but you can't not get this training because it's legitimately all around you everywhere. Just look at it, look for it. You'll see it.
Yeah, thank you. And you lead into this question nicely. Just I think at MDH at least we've heard some mention of, social emotional learning is a phrase that we're not supposed to use anymore, or it gets a somehow it gets a bad connotation, or it's we don't focus on the feelings here, or that's not our job. What are do you encounter that, number one? And number two, are you what are some other challenges that exist with teaching social emotional learning, or convincing others of its importance, or of others of their ability to incorporate it into their work?
Sure. I don't necessarily have a lot of experience with it within children besides my own, or besides, dealing with like my nieces and nephews and things along those lines. However, the biggest challenge that I see in my current position, my position with the prison, I used to be a cognitive behavioral therapist in a prison, and the biggest thing is the buy-in. Having buy-in from people, especially with adults who are, going through challenging situations or challenging things, whether that be um, anything. Again, the biggest thing I witnessed and experienced through my career was incarceration, and so having the buy-in from these individuals and having them know, it takes 3 generations to break trauma or to change behavior or to do that. And so how can we do that now? And I know Jacqueline talked a lot about like the application of that. And so like with cognitive behavioral therapy, having thought sheets. So what was the thought? What was your behavior? What was the all of those things that are combined, but having the buy-in. And so whether that means individuals attending the training and getting them involved in some way with that, or having people who have attended the training maybe speak upon it and how it's helped change them, or how, if they haven't gotten anything from it, how have they um, gotten the application out to other people, again, youth or with adults. And so I think we would get I've received more pushback with adults than I have with children. Children, again, you can really see it as play. You can really see it as, just a part of everyday learning, like, oh, we're having big emotions right now. What do they look like? And so so having them show you with their hands versus if you say that to an adult, they're going to look at you like, what? Like, so what do you like, so how do you, capture your audience? How do you get that buy-in from people? And I would see that as the largest challenge, and it be even as regional behavioral health coordinators having that, pushing out these trainings and maybe not a lot of people showing up because they're like, oh, it's just another training. However, it's just another training that you can really gain some insight from. You can really gain some experience from, whether that be listening to other people's stories, hearing about the training, using some of the applications that are taught in that training, whether in your own life or passing on that information to others. And so really, again, the biggest thing I see is the buy-in, and how do we get that from people?
I think that's really important. And I would say in the event of bringing this training beyond Twin Cities Rise, one of our bigger challenges so we're working with colleges, educational systems, other nonprofits, employers, workforce development centers across the country, recovery centers. We're just doing this work in a lot of different spaces. And one of the biggest challenges we're facing is the investment of time. So I think buy-in is really important as one-on-one or group facilitators or even therapists or leaders. We can create that buy-in once we get them connected to us. However, it's making sure that programming and systems that are already in place have enough time to really do it well. And I think this topic in general is so much more than check the box, you know? And I always say, if you're interested in check the box, that's certainly not what we offer as a program because it's not a quick fix. This is something that you've got to continue the journey and practice for. And there's a reason why. So our biggest challenge is making sure there's enough time in the program to build the quality skills and get to the quality outcome we're looking to achieve with that mission in place. I do think that there has been some type of connotation around the term social emotional learning. Now, I can't say understand root cause of what's happening with the political push or the educational push. I don't understand that, and I don't want to pretend to by any means, but I've heard a little bit of pushback that there's some challenges in certain spaces with that term. I would say our goal is to always find a way to remind ourselves that that's just a content. That's just a category of content. What we're teaching and what we're working on is ways to build empathy in our lives, for ourselves, and each other. So if that feels more comfortable, I'd say use that category. Find the category that works because we can call this social emotional learning. We can call it emotional intelligence. We can call it therapeutic or behavioral interventions. We can name it whatever category we need it to be. At the end of the day, we're building empathy for ourselves and others. And I think that's really important that we recognize what are we trying to get towards? And once we achieve it, how do we continue it? And so I don't know for sure if I understand all the reasoning why the names are different. I don't know, maybe someone can enlighten me after the meeting today or during the Q&A, but I think that we're trying to remind ourselves what is the goal and intention. And maybe social emotional learning as an idea to be a part of curriculum or mandated in curriculum for youth, causes a little bit of friction. I would say making sure that we're including it in any interaction we have with our youth is really about building it forward. So whether we call it curriculum or whether we call it an experience, it's really important that it's embedded in their life, especially if it's in a place that is controlled, like public schools, right? So we have to help provide what maybe isn't happening elsewhere. And if we can bring that in and weave it into our work, what a better world we might start building for ourselves and each other, right? And what a better chance we're giving to our youth. And when we're working with adults, how do we have that relearning how do we create a safe space to get the relearning and build the right time? That actually takes longer to relearn the skill. So you kind of got to think of it in two ways. And then there's that really wonderful age group, that teenage age group, right? Where, yeah, it's probably easy to create the experience and in a younger group, but that middle preteen, teenage years, that's a very different module as well. So we found that in our younger age groups, it was really easy to use play and really easy to use games and build it into the learning. But in this middle group, it was all about, social media. It was all about different types of activities and experiences and allowing people to work together. We also found that it was also helpful to be in, certain private spaces to talk through things. It's hard to be vulnerable at that age. Peer to peer is sometimes very different in a group setting. So it's responding to what they each need to make sure that we're creating the environment that they can best learn. And I think that we've covered a lot of things around it, but at the end of the day, to me, it's all about building towards empathy.
Mhm. That's great. Yeah. You both gave us some different words to frame this in. So I think some of it is knowing your audience and knowing what words they'll respond best to. So thank you for that. So looking at the audience that we have some community organization folks, we have a lot of people from the Minnesota Department of Health. Um, but and we're recording this, so hopefully some others will hear these messages. But how might the folks on this call listening, working in government or community, be active partners in social emotional learning? Are there ways that we can incorporate it more into our injury and violence prevention work?
Sure. I would say get more involved by promoting education on the subject. So, attending these trainings that promote social emotional learning skills and that promote educating further on the social emotional learning skills. Practicing them yourself. So, how can I practice in the moment? How can I utilize these skills myself? So it's noticeable to myself, it's noticeable to others, it's noticeable to my colleagues, to my work, to my family. So practicing them. And if you believe in the product, you'll be able to, in a sense, sell it better. If you believe that you're able to achieve a sense of deeper empathy for yourself, deeper empathy for others, you'll be able to push that, not push, but like display that to others in a way in which makes them want to do the same. Practice working on one aspect each day. So, um, whether it is managing your reactions better this day, have a review every single day of how, like, whether it's with your home life or with your work life, how could I have handled this situation with more or I'm sorry, emotional intelligence? How could I have responded to the situation in a more empathetic manner? Um, Use it as a part of your daily or weekly self care. Use it in that sense and incorporate it into your team meetings. I hate the term icebreaker question. However, they can be really, really helpful. So use it as an icebreaker question. Um, Use it as small activities to promote the self awareness, the self management, responsible decision making, social awareness, and really building those relationship skills, in a sense in which when you're asking these questions with people and you're having these activities, that people don't really recognize that they're learning. They are just building these skills and they're really building them on a framework that can help everyone.
Yeah, I think that, there's so many ways that we can start incorporating it into our work and our lives. And depending on your role, maybe it's in systems change and advocacy. Maybe it's making sure that it's included in programming or included in curriculum and content of programs the state is supporting. Maybe it is in educating within workforce. If you're in HR, you're probably going, where's these people's interpersonal skills? Well, that is emotional intelligence, right? So there's a lot of things within workforce that we can continue to develop and grow. And it is through that emotional intelligence journey. If it's in community, right? How do we establish this within all of the programs that we serve? Because, I always think of emotional intelligence as becoming the best version of yourself. And when we do that, we're a stronger and better community. So I think it is really finding the channel of your work and saying, how do I apply it for myself? But then how do I turn into educating and advocating for it in the work that we're providing, particularly at the state? I mean, you guys are the biggest employer, right? And you have the biggest network. And every employer and every employee is somehow connected to your services. How do we make sure that this is a part of incorporating in what we give to help our communities recover, to help our communities stay strong, to help our communities heal, to help our communities connect? We can call out a lot of problems in our world. Just turn on the local news. But when you think about calling out that solution, this is a huge impact to being a part of the solution. And I think that might, if we internalize that a little bit, it might shift our own mindset. And as we shift our mindsets, it might shift some of our focus in our work, because when we help build the best we can in ourselves, we build it with others. And then that will be reflective in the world that we work and live in.
That is really great. Thank you so much. And I think that's a great space to kind of pause and open it up to questions from folks in the audience, maybe questions or comments about all of this great information that we have just heard. If we have questions about how to include it in our work, I I think you've given us a great kind of layered view of how we can um, incorporate social emotional learning both within our workspace. And we have some supervisors that are on this call too, so incorporating it into how we work as teams. But then also this idea of exploring how we are kind of infusing these concepts into the work that we're supporting out in the community. um, I think there's multiple layers in which we can address this. So I can open the floor and see if folks have questions or comments or ideas about how we can use what we've just learned. You can feel free to come off mute or go in the chat. Oh, Kathy, great.
I'm just wondering, and this is more of a question, have you found differences in a variety of age groups for some of this? I just think with all the electronics, and I think that more concern is being raised around that, but I'm just wondering what you would have as recommendations for bridging those gaps in age and
Yeah.
that kind of thing. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great question. I can speak on behalf of our journey when we had transitioned our curriculum into a youth space. We actually worked with, we kind of were studying and working on research through the efforts of Jean Piaget around cognitive development. So we don't want to be going after teaching a skill and resource, if you will, to someone who cognitively isn't quite ready for that. So we really were working on age groupings. And I can send some follow-up information to Catherine that will share it, but we wanted to be able to say for these age categories, it's really around know yourself, and that's about the self-awareness, and that's what they're cognitively ready for. And then as we broke this into 4 different age groups so we could keep that journey continuing. Right. The next, quadrant and age group really is around navigating your emotions, which is that self-control aspect we talked about. Then it's moving into that other awareness, what's happening around me and how do I impact that? and then really around how am I managing those relationships. So it really is broken kind of by what they cognitively are ready for. We use a lot of behavioral science in our work, and we really wanted to frame that appropriately. But we definitely recognize that technology is key to bringing out our programs. So we want to always have that connection, that human connection for supporting one another, experiencing it together, processing together, that social aspect. We need to create that integrated contact with each other in the cohort. So we still recognize that. But we also have invested in a learning management system. So an enormous amount of our content is in gamified application. And that is for youth and adults. So both of those things are happening simultaneously at our program, where people are meeting on a weekly and biweekly, just like we are today, connected space where we're sharing and processing and building the skills forward. Then they're doing their self work, not homework, their self work. And that's all of those lessons on the learning management system. They're very interactive as well. When the training is done, we've created a mobile app so people can also work that journey anytime, any place. Our mobile app is called Live 24/7, Lovable, Important, Valuable, and Empowered, any day, anytime, any place. We have 2 tracks there. One is for empowered living, one is for empowered employment. So we can support different scenarios and different environments. We spend a lot of time in the app reminding ourselves about mindfulness. That is the most common phrase. We use it, but it's very hard to practice it. So we have a lot of like quick meditations, quick moments of reflection and reminding, just a little bit of centering yourself. That always helps us to release stress and anxiety in any environment. So we do a lot of lessons on our mobile app around that. And then we have continuous learning beyond it. But technology plays a big part in how we learn. And technology plays a big part in how we experience everything. So then we also encourage connection beyond that. At Twin Cities Rise, we have a couple different groups that are happening in a digital space. So we've got some of our social media spaces that are people are connecting in, but we also offer continued quarterly WebExes where anyone can join in, and they're always able to, share personally if they so choose to stay in contact with people and friends that they meet throughout the program.
Thank you.
Mhm. Believe me, we didn't learn that easily. The pandemic forced it. Believe me, we didn't know how much we needed to be virtual until we were in this new modern world of post-pandemic. But it was always in our strategy of how we wanted to deliver. We just didn't know we'd have 6 weeks to deliver it, right? So we're still perfecting a lot of things, but we too are responding to this new world. And the feedback has been really profound. And we've spent a lot of time with instructional designers and educational designers that are experts in social emotional learning and experts in technology to build all these different practice, simulations so people stay engaged. It's not just a bunch of reading. You actually have to, do videos, you're following it, you're journaling along the way. And it is in a standard learning management system. So I can say I'm comparing it to my own college and my daughter's college. I'm like, oh yeah, we are doing some pretty great stuff here. So it's been fun to develop it, but a big undertaking. And we're going to continue to do that with, philanthropy and continued investments into our program because it is the wave of the future and we need to continue to lean into that.
Yeah, I think bringing up the pandemic, I think is really interesting because I remember at the beginning or fairly early on, we talked a lot about the psychological recovery that you had mentioned, Kevin, about, especially with some of our colleagues who were, thrown into some very stressful situations that they were not trained for, and so really needing to support folks in that way. So yeah, this we've been talking about this, and it did kind of like what you said, Jacqueline, like the pandemic made us really talk about it, I think sooner and more intensely than we had thought we were going to. And I do want to acknowledge that John, our colleague John, wrote in the chat a bit about this idea of needing to adjust training and thought processes and the way that we work with youth according to their brain development, and brings up the very good point of, if the brain is not developed to a point of adulthood and decision making, this idea of perhaps we need to rethink when we allow them behind the wheel of a car, which can, cause a lot of injury
Mhm.
because of different developmental stages and one's ability to fully process things. Um, so that's a similarity with kind of that brain development piece. Are there other questions or comments from people in the audience, and or can we think of ways that we might incorporate these concepts into our work?
I actually have a comment. So
Oh,
when you had talked about, I know, COVID and having these, employees or these people just thrown into these experiences that they're not used to. And so how do we have that psychological recovery from that and creating that space for that? So, the RBHCs have created, again, several different trainings. We do and we work and we focus a lot with local public health as well, but we've created healing groups. And so, where there's no management there, where it's just people on, it's not like a multidisciplinary team. It's people who've experienced similar things that can have an open format to talk about them and to talk about their experiences and how they felt during them. And they've brought up several different emotions, several different complexities to their career and their job that people might not have even understood or known or knew that they were going through that at the time. We've also created, it's called 10 minutes for you. So studies have shown that even spending 10 minutes just for yourself every single day helps. It helps in so many different ways. And so every Tuesday and Thursday, the RBHCs create a space on Teams in which we spend 10 minutes. So we do different things. So we do, it's kind of a rotation. So we've done meditation. So yesterday I led a meditation, a 10-minute meditation. We do writing. And then we also do movement. So like whether that be chair yoga, chair stretching. I have a colleague, Hannah Marzinski, who is extremely talented and creative and comes up with these dance parties. At the end of the day, it's 3:50 to 4. So she does like last week she did like a boy band dance party, a 90s boy band, and she did chair ballet, and just creating that space for your employees and giving them those resources in which they can attend if they want or they don't have to, but to really find that place to heal and find that 10 minutes for them. And so it's just a very helpful thing, and I think COVID brought that out in a way in which people can really focus on how can we better help our community, how can we better help our employees, how can we better help just the format in which we've been working in for so long.
yeah. Do we have access to those 10 minutes?
I
Oh,
do. I can get links and calendars, but anyone,
please do.
yes, yep, yes, and it's just a fun experience, and so just pass it on. And if you, I personally don't write. I have the worst grammar. I grew up in the spell check era, where it just wasn't for me until a colleague suggested like just do it. Even if you're writing, I think this is ridiculous. I don't want to do it. Just continue writing that. Continue writing it over and over. Um, but the ideas in the different things that you can get out on paper versus talking with someone, it's a healing experience within itself. And I never liked it until I did it. And then I'm like, oh, this isn't too
Mhm.
terrible, actually. And so having that as well. So
Great. Yeah, I know there are a few good things that came from COVID, and I do agree that I think that's one of them, that we've self-care has become a more common term, and I think while we don't always get to do it, we know how important it is. So we all acknowledge the importance of just, the first step. So
mhm.
um, John also has put in the chat about Cure Violence, a program that stops the spread of violence by using methods and strategies associated with disease control, detecting and interrupting conflicts, identifying and treating the highest risk individuals and changing social norms, and has seen results um, such as reductions in violence of up to 70%. And so he's asking if Cure Violence incorporates social emotional learning, and perhaps how could social emotional learning be better incorporated into Cure Violence. Um, I am not familiar with that, so I don't know if either of you are, or if someone else on the call has can provide insight into that.
I'm not familiar with that, but it looks like something I should definitely look into.
I'm not personally familiar with Cure Violence, but I know that we've been supporting social emotional learning for some initiatives around anti-violence within our communities. So there have been some grants that other partners have received funding for, and we are their partner to bring social emotional learning in as a program augmentation that will help support the goals and initiatives. So we've done an enormous amount of work with Little Earth Residents Association, and they have an expressive lateral violence impact in their communities. And there have been a lot of youth sessions. We've done a lot of healing circles. We've done a lot of work around social emotional learning that has been interwoven into some of the cultural needs that they are experiencing and having. We've done a lot in their adult programs as well. So I think that it is a really important aspect of, you know, any type of program around anti-violence, but I'm not personally familiar with Cure Violence. I just know that it has definitely added great value in the work that we have done in certain aspects when that is the overreaching goal.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point. And I don't really know what my question is with this. It's more of a comment, just that different cultures have different ways of, I guess, interacting with emotions, or different ideas of how to express emotions or not express emotions. And so I guess, have you run into different experiences just with different cultural groups in teaching social emotional learning, and kind of how do you do that in a respectful way?
We do a lot of qualifying and pre-planning, and we spend an enormous amount of time around the goal setting. And during that space, we're recognizing who are we serving in that precious time, and making sure that our materials have been customized for that group and that audience, and that we understand cultural customs that may come up. It's really important that we take the time to do that before we just jump into any type of training. So I
Mhm.
think that's indicative of any training program you do. I hope it is at all levels and spaces, but there's definitely different cultural um, different cultural impact that we have to recognize. There are times where we need to be more gender focused or split things up differently. There are times where we have to be very focused on the community versus just the individual. We have to, bring them together in both. I know at Little Earth, we do a lot of work with their healing, and they have a medicine woman on site who helps us with our sage cleanse before we start our session. They've trained us in what we need to do to make sure that that space is really centered around cultural components that will help individuals. At the end of our sessions, we do a lot of work with their medicine woman, if you will. I believe that's how she is referred to, and she is a bold, beautiful woman who literally makes sure that she's in every one of our spaces and helping to decompress after our sessions, so people are really ready to go back into their day-to-day lives. So there's been a lot of things that we've done in different spaces and different places, but it's more than culture. I want to just kind of call out that I'm even sure that Kevin can give examples of different things that happen within the corrections facility. We've done a lot of reentry work. We've done a lot of work with gangs and gang recovery, and it's a very different space. You need to recognize who we're delivering to, and how do we adapt what we're doing. Maybe 85% of the content is the same, but the 15% is making sure it's relatable and that it's a good experience for those that we're delivering to. So it's more than just culture, it's actually just meeting people where they're at, but taking the time to recognize where are they. We've done a lot of work with correctional officers, all the COs and POs. That's a really different space for us. We're in a prison system, and, they put their guards on, and they're, no emotions. I'm here for work. And it's a very different space when you take that vest off and you take that badge off, and how you move back into your normal life, and how do you make sure you're decompressing and taking care of yourselves. And I was with a really great group in Pennsylvania, and boy, do they use humor as a way for their decompression. They're like the funniest people I've ever met. They all should be stand-up comedians. But it's taking time and walking through that, and creating a space where they can be vulnerable, particularly in a job where they're taught to not be vulnerable. They're literally trained to not be vulnerable, right? So it is really making sure you know who you're delivering to. And it might be a group, it could be something around cultural competence, it could be around just recognizing who we're serving. Women that are coming out of women and children. We do a lot of work where they're in a violent situation, and they're escaping something like a home life or abuse. It's making sure you're adapting that 15% to who you're serving. We've worked with programs around anti-sex trafficking, and they're all victims, and that victimization comes up differently in that type of environment than others. So yes, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in this space. As leaders in this space, we have to be very cognizant of that and very respectful of that. And we spend a lot of time preparing to make sure that it's the best trusted space and the best setup for success as possible.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for going deeper into that. So we have 1 minute left, and we could go on, I think, with a lot more conversation about this and how this can be, really ingrained into our injury and violence prevention work. But our time is up. So I really want to thank you both for joining us. And it was so great to meet both of you and hear about your work, and learn from you. I want to tell everyone who's here, our final wrap up big event is on May 3rd in person at Mystic Lake. We've been invited to join the Safety Council's annual conference again this year. We had a great time last year in person, gathering, networking, learning from each other. And this year, the hope is that we'll take all the things that we've learned from our past webinars and be able to start to plan how we're going to apply them as a group, as supportive of each other, over the next year, looking at these shared risk and protective factors and how we can really move the needle on injury and violence prevention across the state. So more information on that will be coming to you all. Thank you again, Jacqueline and Kevin, for being here and sharing your time and your expertise with us. And I look forward to building on this relationship, because clearly we're all doing work in the same space and can work together on this. So thank you. And thanks to everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks, guys.